forged by battles, refined by fire, built for purpose. I am Alpha A BET-DAWID, and this is where pain becomes power. Welcome to the journey. Some battles in life do not begin with you. Some battles begin long before you ever open your eyes to this world. They begin before your first breath, before your first step, before your first memory. They begin in places and moments that you were never present to witness. They begin in decisions made by other people, in words spoken during moments of anger, in conflicts that took place long before you were old enough to understand what they meant. There are struggles in life that cannot be explained simply by personal choices or circumstances. Sometimes they are tied to family history. Sometimes they are connected to unresolved conflicts between generations. And sometimes they are rooted in spiritual battles that began before a child was even born. For much of my life, I believe the difficulties I experienced were simply the result of bad luck. When relationships collapsed, I blamed timing. When opportunities fell apart, I blamed circumstances. When chaos appeared where peace once existed, I assumed that life was simply unpredictable. But as the years passed and I began reflecting more deeply on the patterns that followed my life, I began to notice something that was impossible to ignore. The same struggles kept appearing again and again. The same patterns kept repeating themselves. Situations that seemed completely unrelated somehow ended with the same outcome. At first, I tried to dismiss it, but eventually, the repetition became too clear to ignore. It began to feel as though something unseen was following my life, something older than me, something that existed long before I understood its presence. And that realization forced me to ask a question that many people never think to ask. What if the battles I was fighting did not begin with me? What if the struggles that followed my life were connected to words spoken long before I was able to defend myself? What if something had been set in motion long before my story even began? The more I reflected on my life and the history of my family, the more I began to realize that what I was experiencing was not random. It was the shadow of something that had been spoken over my bloodline. Before I understood anything about spiritual warfare, before I understood the idea that unseen forces and dark spiritual entities could influence the direction of a person's life, there were already tensions surrounding my family. Conflicts that had roots deeper than I could see at the time. In every family history, there are moments that quietly shape the future of generations to come. Moments that seem small when they occur, but later reveal themselves to be turning points. In my family story, one of those turning points involved a woman named Saleh Khan. Long before my father became part of the picture, Saleh Khan already had connections to my maternal family. She was known by my maternal grandfather intimately. My maternal grandfather was involved in an ongoing adulterous relationship with Saleh Khan. She existed within the same social and cultural environment where relationships, traditions, and spiritual beliefs were deeply intertwined. At that time, life in the community was shaped not only by social relationships, but also by dark traditional spiritual practices in the form of witchcraft that many people believed had real influence over everyday life. Within that environment, certain individuals were believed to possess knowledge of spiritual forces, people who were respected, feared, or consulted when problems arose. Saleh Khan was part of that world. Years passed, and eventually my father entered the picture. not as a perpetrator of these dark practices, but rather as a victim of witchcraft. My father met my mother, Teeny. They got married. Their relationship developed, and not long after, I was born. For a brief moment in time, it appeared that life might settle into a normal rhythm. A family had formed. A new generation had begun. But sometimes the past does not remain in the past. Sometimes people from earlier chapters of a story reappear in ways that reopen conflicts that had never truly been resolved. Not only after my parents had begun their life together and I had entered the world, Sally Khan appeared again in my father's life. Her return did not come quietly. It brought tension. It brought questions. It brought emotions that quickly spread through the family. From the outside, it might have appeared to be nothing more than a complicated relationship situation. But within the cultural and spiritual environment surrounding my family, relationships often carry deeper implications. Jealousy, resentment, and betrayal could quickly escalate into something far more serious when combined with traditional beliefs about spiritual influence. What began as personal conflict slowly expanded into something that touched multiple members of the family. Feelings hardened, trust was broken, accusations were whispered, and tensions that might have been resolved through communication instead began to grow in silence. In environments where spiritual practices are believed to influence life, conflicts between people do not always remain purely emotional. Sometimes they move into another realm entirely. That is exactly what began to happen. The disagreement surrounding my father did not remain simply a family argument. It began to take on spiritual dimensions. People sought answers from sources that promised power over unseen forces. Old traditions were consulted, ritual knowledge was invoked, and decisions were made that would send consequences far beyond that moment. At the time, no one could fully see how far those consequences would reach. What started as a conflict between adults would eventually ripple outward through the years. It would affect marriages. It would affect relationships. It would affect emotional stability. And eventually, it would reach me. Because sometimes, when spiritual conflicts are set in motion, they do not remain confined to the people who began them. They move through families. They move through generations. They follow bloodlines. And in ways that are difficult to explain, they begin to shape the lives of people who were never present when the conflict first began. What happened in those early moments would become the beginning of a long chain of events. Events that will shape my father's life and eventually shape mine as well. On the way to my father, my maternal grandparents, especially my grandmother Maria too, who later in her years became the Grand Witch of a family shrines of satanic practices, were deeply involved in dark traditional spiritual practices, witchcraft, that were part of the culture in the region where they lived. These practices were not just casual beliefs or superstitions that people mention in passing. They were systems of power that many people believed could influence health, relationships, success, and even life itself, which they would use to execute and manipulate their wicked agendas of control over the lives and destinies of others. Within that world, certain individuals were known to possess deeper knowledge and stronger spiritual authority. My grandmother was connected to relatives who were recognized in the family as powerful practitioners and witches of those traditions. People who were feared and respected for their supposed ability to manipulate unseen forces to bring about various misfortunes, unfortunate demise on innocent people that come across their path. When the conflict surrounding my parents began to grow, Emotions within the family escalated. What started as a personal frustration and resentment slowly turned into something far more serious. According to what I later came to understand, my grandmother sought the help of these relatives in an attempt to retaliate against my father. Instead of allowing the situation to settle naturally, the decision was made to seek spiritual intervention. Rituals were performed, words were spoken, intentions were set. In many traditional belief systems, words spoken during rituals are believed to carry weight, especially when they are spoken by people who are thought to have spiritual authority. The purpose of those words was simple but devastating. The declaration that was made over my father's life was that he would never find peace in relationships, that every woman he joined himself to would eventually become a source of conflict, that stability will always slip away, that every relationship would eventually break apart, that he would move from one broken relationship to another, never able to build something lasting. In essence, it was believed that his ability to build a stable family life had been spiritually sabotaged. At the time, no one could fully measure the long-term consequences of those actions. Dark rituals and various forms of witchcraft done late in the midnight hours against my father. Words spoken in anger or revenge may feel powerful in the moment, but their effects can ripple outward far beyond what anyone expects. As the years passed, something strange began to unfold in my father's life. The pattern began to repeat itself again and again. Relationships would begin with promise, but over time, they will deteriorate. Conflict will rise, trust will break down, and eventually, the relationship would collapse. My father married multiple times throughout his life, 6 times in total. Each marriage carried a hope that things would finally settle. Each marriage carried the possibility of stability, but every attempt eventually ended in separation or divorce. At first glance, many people might look at the pattern and simply assume that my father was the problem, that perhaps he was making poor choices, or that he simply had bad luck in relationships. But when a pattern repeats itself with that level of consistency, it begins to raise deeper questions. It begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a shadow following someone's life. But the most unsettling realization came years later. Because when words of destruction are spoken over the person's life in certain belief systems, those words are often believed to extend beyond the individual. They are believed to follow the bloodline, and that is where the story begins to affect me. For many years, I lived my life without understanding the deeper spiritual background behind my family's history. Like most young people, I was simply trying to navigate life, relationships, and the pursuit of stability. But as time passed, I began noticing patterns in my own life that were eerily similar to what my father had experienced. Relationships would begin with hope. At first, everything would feel right. The connection would feel genuine. The future would appear promising. But slowly, something would begin to change. Conflict would appear where none existed before. Misunderstandings would grow into major disagreements. Situations that once seemed stable would begin to crumble. And before long, the relationship would collapse entirely. At first, I assumed it was simply part of life. Everyone experiences relationship struggles, after all. But as the years passed, the pattern kept repeating itself over and over again. Relationships that should have had potential somehow turned into situations that brought emotional damage, confusion, or instability. Good women will sometimes enter my life, but those connections rarely lasted. And in many cases, the relationships that did remain were the ones that carried the greatest risk. Relationships that could have led me down destructive paths. There were times when I looked at the situation and I wondered if I was somehow attracting the wrong people. There were times when I wondered if I was simply incapable of building something stable. The question will come to my mind again and again. Why does this keep happening? Why does stability always seem just out of reach? Why does every attempt to build something lasting eventually fall apart? These patterns followed me through my 20s. They continued through my 30s. And even as I entered my 40s, the struggle had not completely disappeared. For decades, it felt as though an invisible barrier existed between me and the type of stability that many people seemed able to build naturally. At times, it felt like an unseen force was constantly redirecting my life away from peace and toward conflict. It created a sense of frustration that was difficult to explain to anyone who had not lived through it. Because when patterns repeat themselves for long enough, they begin to feel like destiny. As the years passed and the patterns in my life became more visible, there was someone who quietly watched it all unfold. My own biological mother. She knew things about my family's past that I did not yet understand. She knew about the conflict that had taken place between my father and her family. She knew about the rituals that had been performed. She knew about the words that had been spoken. And she knew about the curses that had been directed toward my father by her family. But what made the situation even more painful was this. She also knew that the consequences of those actions had not stopped with my father. They had reached me. My mother witnessed the struggles that unfolded throughout my life. She saw the instability. She saw the relationships that collapsed. She saw the setbacks that seemed to appear again and again. She saw the frustration, the confusion, and the battles that followed me for years. And deep inside, she understood that many of those struggles were connected to something that had happened long before I was old enough to defend myself. But there was a problem. Within her family, secrecy was absolute. The practices that had taken place were not things that were openly discussed. They were protected by silence, by loyalty, by fear of exposing the spiritual system that her family had been part of for generations. In that world, revealing the truth about those practices was considered betrayal. And that oath of secrecy placed my mother in an impossible position. On one side, she was a daughter tied to her family's traditions and expectations. On the other side, she was a mother watching her son struggle under the consequences of actions that had been taken by that same family. Instead of speaking openly about what had happened, she carried the burden quietly. In fact, she would fight anyone, even me, to preserve the practices of her family. They had long depended on those dark acts to achieve things they believed they could not accomplish naturally. Through their witchcraft, they sought to obtain what they wanted by manipulating circumstances through dark spiritual practices, even at the cost of people's lives. So, she watched, she observed, and she remained silent. At times, she tried to ease her conscience in the only way she felt she could. She would reach out to me with financial help from time to time. Money would appear during moments when my life had become difficult. But as the years passed, I began to realize something important. Those gestures were not always about my actual needs. They were often expressions of something deeper: guilt, regret, a quiet attempt to soften the consequences of something she knew had affected my life. But financial support cannot repair what silence keeps hidden. Money cannot undo patterns that have been set in motion for years. And although those gestures may have brought temporary relief, they never addressed the root of the struggle I was consistently going through. Because the truth remained unspoken. And the more I reflected on the situation, the more I came to understand the depth of the tragedy within it. My mother was caught between two loyalties: the loyalty she felt toward the traditions and secrecy of her family's dark practices of witchcraft, and the love she felt for her son. But in the end, the silence remained. The practices of her family were protected. The truth was withheld, and I was left to navigate the consequences of those unseen battles without fully understanding where they had begun and why. In many ways, that silence became one of the most painful parts of the entire story. When a mother chooses her family's dark practices of witchcraft over the freedom of her own biological son. Because sometimes the deepest wounds in life are not caused by enemies. Due to their insecurity and shortcomings hidden beneath the covering of their pride, they remain sworn to silence, even when they know the truth but feel unable to speak. Living under repeated patterns of instability does something profound to the human mind. When things fall apart once or twice, you can recover. You tell yourself it was simply a bad experience. But when the same type of outcome continues to appear year after year, it begins to shape the way you see yourself and the world around you. You begin asking difficult questions. Am I the problem? Is there something wrong with me? Why does everything seem to collapse no matter how hard I try to build something meaningful? Those questions begin to echo inside your mind. Over time, frustration turns into emotional exhaustion. You start approaching relationships with hesitation rather than hope. You become cautious, guarded, and skeptical of stability. Trust becomes harder. Vulnerability becomes dangerous because experience has taught you that what begins well may not last. There is also the loneliness that grows from these experiences. Watching others build families, marriages, and stable lives while your own attempts repeatedly fail can create a deep sense of isolation. You begin to feel as though stability belongs to other people, but not you. That emotional fatigue can weigh heavily on the heart. It can create discouragement that slowly erodes confidence and peace. The instability did not stop with relationships. When emotional and relational chaos becomes a recurring part of life, it often spills over into other areas. Your decision-making becomes affected. Your focus becomes divided. Your ability to plan long-term becomes difficult. When your emotional world is constantly being disrupted, it becomes harder to build consistent momentum in other areas of your life. Financial stability requires focus, discipline, and long-term planning. But when your life is repeatedly disrupted by emotional upheaval, that focus becomes harder to maintain. You begin building something only to have circumstances derail your progress. You take steps forward only to find yourself pulled backward again. The cycle repeats itself often enough that you begin wondering if something deeper is influencing the path of your life. Not simply bad luck, not simply poor decisions, but something deeper, something rooted in history, environment, and unseen influences that were set in motion long before you understood them. And when you begin to recognize that possibility, it forces you to confront a difficult realization. Some battles in life begin long before we understand that we are fighting them. Years later, when my life began moving in a different direction and I started seeking God more seriously, something began to unfold in my understanding that I had never fully considered before. For most of my life, I believed the struggles I experienced were simply the result of circumstances, poor choices, or unfortunate patterns. When relationships collapsed, when opportunities disappeared, when chaos seemed to follow stability, I assumed it was simply the randomness of life. But as I began learning more about faith, prayer, and the spiritual dimension that Scripture speaks about, my perspective began to change. I began to look at my life not only through the lens of personal decisions, but through the lens of the spiritual environment I had been born into. Suddenly, patterns that once seemed confusing began to make more sense. It was as if pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered throughout my life were slowly coming together. I began to realize that some of the battles I had been fighting were older than I was. There were battles connected to a family history, battles connected to words that had been spoken long before I understood their weight, battles connected to an environment where spiritual practices were not just stories or traditions, but things people believed had real influence over life. This realization did not remove my responsibility for my own decisions. I still have to acknowledge my mistakes and take responsibility for my actions. But it did something else. It helped me understand that some of the struggles I experienced were not simply personal failures. They were battles connected to forces, beliefs, and influences that had surrounded my life from the very beginning. And once I began to see that possibility, something even more powerful became clear. If darkness had influence, then light had greater authority. If words spoken in anger could create destruction, then words spoken in truth could bring restoration. And that is when the most important truth began to take root in my heart. Even when something negative is spoken over a life, it does not have the final word, because God has the power to overturn what was spoken in darkness. God has the power to interrupt patterns that appear unbreakable. God has the power to take a life that seems trapped in cycles of failure and transform it into something completely different. The more I grew spiritually, the more I began to see that the story of my life was not simply about the struggles I had endured. It was about the process of breaking those struggles. And that process begins when a person begins to seek God with sincerity and humility. One of the most profound realizations I had when reflecting on my life was recognizing the role that separation played in protecting me. There were moments in my life when I was removed from environments where certain practices and influences were taking place. At the time, those separations did not always make sense to me. Sometimes they felt painful. Sometimes they felt confusing. Sometimes they felt like abandonment or rejection. But years later, When I look back on those moments with a clearer understanding, I began to see them differently. What once looked like loss was often protection. My father, knowingly or unknowingly, played a role in creating distance between me and certain environments connected to my maternal family's practices. At the time, I did not fully understand why that separation existed. As a child or a young man, you often interpret separation as something negative. You feel as though something important has been taken away from you. But what I came to realize later was that sometimes separation is the very thing that prevents someone from becoming entangled in patterns that could destroy their future. Being separated from that environment did not immediately remove every struggle I experienced. The pattern still followed me for many years. The confusion still existed. The emotional battles still appeared. But what that separation did accomplish was something extremely important. It prevented me from becoming part of the system that created those struggles in the first place. It prevented me from adopting practices that could have bound my life even more deeply into cycles of darkness. Sometimes when God protects a person, He does not remove every battle immediately. Instead, He begins by removing them from the place where the battleground originated. He creates distance between them and the influences that could have shaped them in destructive ways. And although the individual may still have to face consequences, patterns, and struggles that were already in motion, that separation gives them something powerful: the opportunity to choose a different path. Let me say something to anyone who is watching or listening to this story. Sometimes the struggles you face in life are not just about you. They may be connected to things that happened long before you were born. They may be connected to wounds that exist in your family history. They may be connected to patterns that have repeated themselves through multiple generations. Some families struggle with cycles of poverty. Some struggle with cycles of addiction. Some struggle with cycles of broken relationships. And some struggle with spiritual influences that shape the environment in which children grow up. But here is the truth that many people need to hear. Just because something existed in your past does not mean it must control your future. Patterns can be broken. Cycles can be interrupted. History does not have to repeat itself. When a person begins to see God, something powerful begins to happen. Light enters places where darkness once dominated. Truth begins to expose things that once remained hidden. And slowly, the grip of destructive patterns begins to loosen. Breaking generational struggles is rarely instantaneous. It is often a process of learning, a process of healing, a process of replacing old beliefs with truth. But the moment someone begins seeking transformation through faith, they begin stepping into a different future, because God's purpose for life is always greater than the darkness that tried to shape it. When I look back at my life now, I see a journey that has been shaped by many battles. Some of those battles were visible: conflicts, struggles, and obstacles that anyone could see from the outside. But many of the battles were invisible. They existed beneath the surface. They were battles of influence, identity, belief, and spiritual direction. And yet, every battle, both visible and invisible, served a purpose. They forced me to search for answers. They forced me to confront questions about my life, my past, and my future. They forced me to seek something greater than the patterns that had shaped my early years. And through that process, I began to understand something important. Your past may explain the struggles you face. It may help you understand where certain patterns began, but it does not determine where your life must end. Because when God has a purpose for someone's life, even the darkest parts of their story can be transformed into something meaningful. What once looked like a curse can become a testimony. What once looked like destruction can become preparation. What once looked like failure can become the foundation for transformation. The same experiences that once seemed like obstacles can become the very things that equip a person to help others who are walking through similar struggles. And that is one of the greatest truths I have learned. Your story is not defined by the battles you faced. It is defined by the purpose that emerges from those battles. Because when God begins writing the final chapter of a life, even curses can become part of the story He uses to build you. This is Alpha A BET-DAWID. If this testimony spoke to you, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who may need encouragement, and subscribe so you don't miss the next testimony in this journey. And I encourage you, leave a comment below and share what this message meant to you. If you believe generational struggles can be broken through faith, write the word freedom in the comments. Also, if you want to go deeper into this journey, you can find the links to my books, Timbo, A Victim of God's Purpose, in the description below. Because your story matters, your journey matters, and your life is not random. And I will see you in the next testimony.